What happens when a country spends 40 years convincing itself that burying its most valuable weapons, hundreds of feet inside a mountain, makes them untouchable? And then a single bomb proves that the assumption that held for 4 decades was never actually true? Before we dive into this extraordinary story of how the United States just cracked open Iran's most protected underground missile facility, hit that like button right now, because understanding this means understanding why no mountain is truly safe anymore. Subscribe if you want to follow this conflict, as it actually unfolds with the kind of grounded analysis you will not find anywhere else. And send this to someone who still thinks burying weapons deep underground guarantees survival, because this story proves otherwise. There is a mountain in Iran that engineers spent 4 decades convinced could never be cracked open. Then, on a night most of the world only heard about after it was already over, a single American weapon punched straight through hundreds of feet of solid stone and answered that assumption with fire. For most of my career, I spent time around people who plan these kinds of operations. The ones who read satellite imagery for a living and think in terms of penetration depth and structural collapse radius rather than headlines. And when something like this happens, the instinct in most newsrooms is to reach for the biggest possible adjective: devastating, secret, unstoppable. My job here is different. My job is to take you underneath the adjective and show you what actually happened, weapon by weapon, decision by decision, so that by the end of this video, you understand this strike better than 90% of the people currently arguing about it online. Here is what we are going to cover. First, why Iran built an entire military doctrine around the idea that depth alone equals safety, and how that idea shaped 40 years of tunnel construction. Second, the specific weapon the United States used to challenge that doctrine and why it is fundamentally different from anything Tehran's engineers designed their defenses to survive. Third, what independent analysts are actually saying about how much damage was done, because the real picture is far messier than either side's public statements suggest. And finally, what this strike means for the fractured, two-headed way Iran's government is currently functioning, because that fracture might matter more than the bomb itself. One more thing before we dive in. I'm not going to sit here and tell you this strike single-handedly ended anything, because it did not. And anyone claiming otherwise is selling you a headline instead of an explanation. What I can tell you with real confidence is exactly what this weapon was built to do, exactly what it appears to have done, and exactly where the honest uncertainty still remains. That distinction between confirmed fact and confident-sounding speculation is where most coverage of this strike falls apart. It is also exactly where we are going to spend the next several minutes. Let us start with the mountain. Iran never had the luxury of fighting the United States or Israel in the open. Its fighter jets are decades old, patched together from parts acquired before international sanctions choked off new purchases. Its air defense network, while improved in recent years, has repeatedly proven porous against modern precision strikes. Iranian military planners understood this weakness decades ago, and rather than try to close the gap in the sky, they made a different bet entirely. If you cannot win the air war, take the war underground, where airplanes and radar cannot reach you. That bet produced what analysts now describe as a hidden missile infrastructure, carved into mountainous terrain in the country's interior, with one particularly significant complex believed to sit near Isfahan. Picture not a single bunker, but a sprawling underground network. Tunnels branching into storage chambers, launch corridors, and maintenance bays, all bored into rock specifically chosen for its density. Commercial satellite imagery going back the better part of 2 decades shows this site expanding in visible phases. New tunnel mouths appear. Existing entrances get reinforced. The terrain around each opening is shaped and landscaped to blend the site into the surrounding mountainside, making it deliberately difficult for outside observers to know exactly where the real vulnerabilities are. Some intelligence assessments go further, suggesting Iran built decoy entrances into the same mountain range, false doors engineered purely to absorb an expensive American munition and detonated against empty rock instead of an actual missile depot. This was not a rushed wartime improvisation. This was patient, expensive generational planning built on one core assumption that if you bury something deep enough, no bomb designed to level a building on the surface will ever be able to follow it down. And for a very long time, that assumption held. It is worth understanding that Iran did not invent this doctrine out of nowhere. Burying critical military infrastructure under mountains is a strategy with real precedent elsewhere in the world. North Korea has spent decades doing something similar, hollowing out entire ridgelines to shelter artillery, command posts, and portions of its weapons program from anything short of a direct nuclear strike. Hezbollah, operating on a far smaller scale in southern Lebanon, built its own extensive tunnel networks for many of the same reasons: cheap concealment, difficult targeting, and a sense of psychological invulnerability for the fighters and commanders sheltering below. What made Iran's version distinctive was not the concept itself. It was the scale and the integration, tying underground missile storage directly into a broader industrial and military supply chain so that production, storage, and eventual launch could all theoretically happen without ever fully exposing the process to outside observation. If you are finding this breakdown valuable, drop a like right now and share this video with anyone trying to understand the hidden war beneath Iran's mountains. This is the kind of context that completely changes how you see the news. Analysts who study these networks point out that the entire doctrine rests on a kind of quiet arms race that rarely makes headlines. One side digging deeper, the other side developing weapons capable of reaching further down. For most of the 21st century, the digging kept pace with the drilling power of the weapons built to counter it. This strike is one of the clearest signals yet that the balance in that quiet race has shifted. Then came what is now being referred to as Operation Epic Fury, the campaign that changed the equation. As the broader regional conflict intensified, spilling into shipping lanes near the Strait of Hormuz and escalating into direct strikes on nuclear-linked facilities at Fordow and Natanz, American forces began a sustained effort to dismantle Iran's missile and drone production and storage capacity. According to statements from senior Pentagon officials, including Joint Chiefs Chairman General Dan Kane, this campaign marked the combat debut of a weapon most people outside defense circles had never heard of, a 5,000-pound precision-guided munition known as the GBU-72. This is not a bomb designed to flatten a structure on impact. It is engineered to do something far more specific and frankly far more dangerous for whatever is waiting underground. It is built to punch through layer after layer of rock and reinforced concrete, hold itself together through that violent descent without breaking apart prematurely, and only detonate once it has reached the open space deep inside where the actual target sits. Officials have confirmed the weapon was first deployed against Iranian underground facilities storing coastal defense cruise missiles near the Strait of Hormuz. From there, according to open source, military analysts tracking the campaign, the same class of weapon, or something functionally identical to it, was used against the far larger underground missile complex believed to be positioned in Iran's interior near Isfahan. That is the strike everyone is now talking about because the footage that emerged from it does not look like a conventional bombing run at all. It looks like the mountain itself caught fire from within. Watch the video closely and you will notice a pattern. There is the initial impact, sharp and contained. Then, in the minutes that follow, secondary detonations start ripping through the rock in waves, each one larger and more violent than the last. That sequence tells you something important. Those are not the bomb continuing to detonate. That is what happens when a weapon reaches a chamber packed with stored missiles, propellant, and warheads, and triggers a chain reaction that the mountain's own structure can no longer contain. Every explosion after the first one is Iran's own stockpile going off from the inside out. There is a detail here that rarely makes it into mainstream coverage, but that analysts who study these sites find genuinely fascinating. How you actually tell a real tunnel entrance apart from a decoy one before you commit an expensive weapon to it. It usually is not done by looking at a single satellite pass. It is done by tracking patterns over months and years. Vehicle traffic near an entrance, subtle changes in soil disturbance from ventilation shafts, venting excess heat or exhaust, thermal signatures that spike at irregular intervals consistent with actual machinery running inside rather than an empty shell built purely for deception. Real underground missile storage generates its own quiet signature. Heat, power draw, human movement, even if the facility itself is never directly visible from above. Decoys, by contrast, tend to stay eerily static over time because there is genuinely nothing happening inside them to generate the kind of pattern a real operational site produces. Piecing that picture together took years of patient, unglamorous intelligence work long before a single bomb was ever cleared to drop. And it is a big part of why this particular strike landed where it actually mattered instead of cratering an empty stretch of rock. Now, let us talk about why this particular weapon broke the math Iran spent 40 years building around. Every munition, when it strikes something dense, decelerates. The denser the material, the faster it slows and the less distance it can cover before either stopping short or detonating prematurely. Iranian defense engineers understood this principle intimately. For decades, they calculated exactly how deep their storage chambers needed to be to sit safely beyond the reach of older American bunker-busting weapons like the GBU-28. Build past that threshold, and in theory, nothing above ground could touch you. Older penetrating weapons ran into two persistent problems trying to beat that calculation. The first was simple depth. A bomb that exhausts its penetrating force before reaching the target just carves a crater in solid rock and stops, leaving whatever stored beneath it completely intact. The second problem is one most people never think about. The weapon itself has to physically survive the journey. Slamming into concrete and stone at extreme velocity puts enormous structural stress on a bomb's casing. Older designs sometimes shattered mid-penetration or detonated too early, wasting their entire payload on empty tunnel rather than the actual target buried further down. The GBU-72 was engineered specifically to solve both of those failures at once. Its casing is built from hardened alloy designed to withstand the violent deceleration forces that would tear apart older bunker busters, and its fuse operates on a delay by design. It does not trigger on first impact. It does not trigger a few feet in. It counts, sensing its way through successive layers of rock and reinforced concrete, waiting until its internal sensors detect it has broken into open space, exactly the kind of open chamber where missiles, fuel, and warheads would actually be stored. Only then does the 5,000-pound warhead detonate. That single engineering decision is the entire difference between scarring the outside of a mountain and obliterating what is hidden inside it. There's a second factor that matters almost as much as the bomb's design: how quickly it can actually reach the target. Some of the heaviest bunker-busting weapons in the American arsenal, like the 30,000-pound massive ordnance penetrator, can only be carried by the B-2 stealth bomber, which typically has to launch from bases as far away as Missouri or the remote island of Diego Garcia. That is a mission that takes many hours in the air and days of advanced planning. The GBU-72 does not require any of that. It is light enough to be carried by an F-15E Strike Eagle already based in the region, which means a jet sitting on a regional runway can be loaded, airborne, and over a target in well under an hour once the order comes down. That kind of speed fundamentally changes what is operationally possible. It means American forces are not limited to hitting targets planned weeks in advance. They can respond in near real time to fresh intelligence about where missile stockpiles are actually being moved or stored. The GBU-72's guidance system adds one more layer of resilience on top of that speed. It can navigate to fixed GPS coordinates independently, but it can also accept updated targeting data during its final approach. If a pilot has to break off suddenly to evade a surface-to-air missile, the bomb does not simply drift off. Course and miss. It locks onto the last confirmed target location and continues toward it. In an environment where Iranian air defenses have been degraded but not eliminated, that resilience matters enormously for the air crews flying these missions. At this point, if you are enjoying this deep dive and want to stay updated on how this story develops, make sure you are subscribed. Hit that subscribe button, turn on the notification bell, and join our community of viewers who understand that the real story is always what happens beneath the surface. It also helps to understand where this weapon fits into a much longer lineage. Bunker-busting munitions are not new. The concept dates back to the Gulf War era when engineers first modified existing artillery barrels into crude but effective penetrating bomb casings after watching earlier weapons fail to reach buried Iraqi command bunkers. Every generation since has chased the same basic goal: more penetration, more reliability, less wasted payload, refined, through decades of trial, failure, and battlefield feedback. The GBU-28 that Iran's engineers spent years designing around was itself considered cutting edge when it entered service, a massive leap over anything that came before it. But weapons technology does not stand still just because an adversary has finished calculating its defenses around a specific threshold. The GBU-72 represents the next link in that chain, built using lessons learned from years of penetrator, testing, metallurgy, improvements, and a far more sophisticated understanding of exactly how rock and reinforced concrete behave under extreme sudden stress. Iran was not defending against a static threat. It was defending against a moving target that kept getting better while its own defensive depth stayed fixed in place. Put it all together: a weapon engineered to survive violent penetration, timed to detonate at precisely the right depth, and deliverable within the hour by jets already stationed in the region. And you start to understand why officials and independent analysts alike are calling this strike a genuine turning point rather than just another bombing run in a long conflict. But here is where the story gets more complicated, because not everyone agrees on how much actual damage was done. Several open-source military analysts who reviewed satellite imagery taken after the strikes on Iran's underground missile facilities in Hormozgan and near Isfahan offered a noticeably more cautious read than the initial headline suggested. According to their analysis, the strikes appear to have severely damaged tunnel entrances, surface support buildings, and visible equipment. But the deepest vertical launch shafts, arguably the actual core of the complex, show no confirmed direct hits. In other words, this strike may have sealed the mountain rather than fully destroyed everything sheltered inside it. That distinction matters more than it might sound. Sealing an entrance can still prevent missiles from being wheeled out for launch for weeks or even months at a time. It can trap transporter vehicles inside the tunnel network. It can knock out the surface logistics Iran would actually need to move anything from the facility toward a launch position. Even a strike that falls short of total destruction can still impose a real operational cost, just a different kind of cost than the dramatic footage might suggest at first glance. And that gap between perception and reality matters for a specific reason. Iran's ballistic missile stockpile is not just a weapons cache. It is the connective tissue holding together nearly every other piece of the country's strategic posture. Without a credible missile threat, almost everything else Iran relies on to project power in, the region loses much of its weight. It is not sentimental attachment to old hardware. It is that the missile program is functionally load-bearing for Tehran's entire strategy. If this kind of geopolitical breakdown is exactly what you come here for, go ahead and subscribe now, because we are about to get into the messiest part of this entire story. What is actually happening inside Iran's own government while all of this unfolds. Here is something that has remained consistent through this entire conflict. And honestly, it might be the single most important thing to understand if you want to know why ceasefires and negotiations keep collapsing before they can take hold. Iran's government does not speak with one voice. In practice, it behaves like two separate centers of power that frequently do not agree with each other. On one side sits the political and diplomatic leadership, the foreign ministry, parliamentary negotiators, and whatever remains of the inner circle around Iran's supreme leader. Their priorities tend to center on regaining international legitimacy, securing relief from crippling sanctions, and avoiding a total military collapse of the regime's structure. On the other side sits the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, which controls the bulk of Iran's missile program, its drone fleet, and its network of regional proxy forces. Their institutional interest runs in a very different direction: protect the leverage that ballistic missiles and drone capability provide, and resist any agreement that would meaningfully shrink that power, because that power is precisely what makes the IRGC matter inside Iran's own domestic political system. Throughout this conflict, a strange and almost contradictory pattern has shown up again and again. Political officials signal openness to a deal, sometimes even claiming one has already been reached. At the very same moment, IRGC-linked forces continue their operations, occasionally escalating rather than pulling back. This has happened repeatedly during this campaign, including reports of attacks on shipping traffic in the Strait of Hormuz occurring at almost the exact same time diplomatic statements were suggesting real progress toward negotiations. This is not necessarily confusion or bureaucratic incompetence. It may be something more structural. Two institutions inside the same government, operating under different mandates, making different decisions, sometimes without meaningful coordination between them at all. That creates a serious problem for anyone trying to negotiate with Iran in good faith, because a political commitment made in Tehran does not automatically bind the military commanders who actually control missile launches and drone operations on the ground. This is part of why, even after a strike as significant as the one near Isfahan, and even after reports suggesting movement toward a possible agreement, nobody closely watching this conflict is treating any deal as final until it has actually been implemented and held for a meaningful stretch of time. The pattern has repeated itself over and over throughout this war. Announcement, continued operations, denial, another announcement, until actions on the ground actually match the words being said in press briefings. Skepticism remains the responsible default. As we approach the end of this analysis, if you have made it this far, you are exactly the kind of viewer who wants to understand the world beyond the headlines. Drop a like, share this with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe so you do not miss the next deep dive. Your engagement keeps this channel going and helps us bring you the context that mainstream media often misses. Meanwhile, the wider regional picture has not calmed down either. The Strait of Hormuz, one of the most economically vital oil shipping corridors on the planet, has repeatedly been declared closed by Iranian naval forces over the course of this conflict, even as hundreds of commercial vessels continue transiting the waterway under American naval escort. That gap between declaration and reality tells you a great deal about where actual control of the strait currently sits. And it also explains exactly why Iran's missile stockpile matters so much to its ability to make that kind of threat credible going forward. The ripple effects of that credibility question show up far from the battlefield, in places most people would not immediately connect to a strike on a mountain in Iran's interior. Roughly a fifth of the world's seaborne oil passes through the Strait of Hormuz on any given day. And every time Iranian officials so much as hint at closing it, energy markets react within hours. Shipping insurers adjust premiums for tankers transiting the region. Gulf producers quietly reroute cargo through alternative pipelines where possible. Traders in London, New York, and Singapore price in a risk premium that has nothing to do with actual supply and everything to do with the plausibility of Iran following through on its threats. A degraded missile and drone arsenal, even one that is only partially degraded, changes that calculation. It is one of the quieter but more immediate ways this strike reaches ordinary people who will never watch footage of a mountain exploding, but who might notice the price at the pump shift because of it. This conflict has also revealed something bigger about where military technology as a whole is heading, and it is worth pausing on for a moment before we wrap up. Alongside these bunker buster strikes, this war has effectively become a live proving ground for a new generation of low-cost AI-assisted weapon systems. Cheap precision drones costing a tiny fraction of the missiles they are being used to intercept or destroy. Autonomous naval systems operating in real combat conditions for the first time. Coordination software linking multiple unmanned platforms together with crewed aircraft in ways that were purely theoretical just a few years ago. None of this is experimental anymore. It is actively being used, tested, and refined in real time in an actual shooting war. That shift matters well beyond this single conflict. It signals a broader change in how future wars might be fought, where expensive, exquisitely engineered legacy weapons on one side increasingly face off against swarms of cheap, smart, expendable systems on the other. Iran is not just fighting a war right now. It is watching in real time exactly what a future built around this kind of technology looks like. And so is every other country paying close attention to how this campaign continues to unfold. So where does all of this actually leave us? The strike near Isfahan did not erase Iran's missile program. Based on the most careful analysis currently available, it likely damaged entrances, surface infrastructure, and visible equipment more severely than it destroyed the deepest, most protected launch capability buried far below ground. But it accomplished something else, something arguably more consequential in the long run. It proved publicly and undeniably that the core assumption Iran built its entire underground strategy around, the belief that depth alone guarantees safety, is no longer something Tehran can count on. For 40 years, Iranian military planners studied American weapons capabilities, calculated exactly how deep was deep enough, and built accordingly. That calculation was based on the tools the United States had available at the time. The GBU-72 represents a new answer to an old question, and it forces Iran's leadership to confront an uncomfortable follow-up. If this weapon reached this particular mountain, what other mountains built to those same specifications are just as exposed right now? That uncertainty alone reshapes the strategic picture. Even without another single bomb being dropped, every future decision Iran's leadership makes about its missile program now has to account for the real possibility that depth is no longer the guarantee it used to represent. That kind of doubt is quiet, but it is powerful. It will not show up in a headline the way footage of a mountain erupting from the inside does, but it lingers in every planning meeting, every construction decision, every calculation about where to hide the next generation of weapons. There are really only a handful of ways this trajectory plays out from here, and it is worth walking through them briefly rather than leaving it vague. One path has continued targeted strikes against remaining underground sites as intelligence identifies them. A slow, grinding campaign rather than a single decisive blow, gradually degrading Iran's stored capability faster than it can be rebuilt or relocated. A second path is some form of negotiated freeze, likely brokered under enormous international pressure, where Iran agrees to curtail further underground expansion in exchange for sanctions relief, even though history suggests the IRGC's cooperation with any such freeze would remain uncertain at best. A third, less discussed possibility is that Iran doubles down entirely, accelerating construction of new sites built even deeper and further from predictable strike corridors, essentially betting that the next generation of concealment can outpace the next generation of penetrating weapons. The same bet that just failed near Isfahan, made again with slightly different numbers. None of these paths are mutually exclusive. And given how divided Iran's own leadership currently is, it is entirely possible different factions pursue more than one of them simultaneously, which would only deepen the kind of internal contradiction we have already seen play out in public statements throughout this conflict. Wars like this one rarely end with a single dramatic strike, no matter how much a mountain exploding on camera might suggest otherwise. They end, when they end at all, through a slow, uneven mix of sustained military pressure, economic exhaustion, and internal political struggle. Exactly the kind we have watched play out between Iran's political leadership and its military commanders throughout this entire conflict. What the Isfahan strike really did was tilt part of that internal balance. It raised the cost of Iran continuing to rely on underground storage as its primary line of defense at a moment when its own leadership is already deeply divided over what comes next. Whether that pressure is ultimately enough to produce a lasting agreement, or whether it simply becomes one more chapter in a long, unresolved standoff is still being written in real time. But one thing has already changed for good. The mountain that was supposed to be untouchable answered back, and after this strike, nobody, not Iran's engineers, not its military commanders, not the people currently deciding what to build next, can look at a mountain the same way again. If this video helped you actually understand what is happening in this conflict instead of just watching a headline scroll by, that is exactly the reason this channel exists. Hit subscribe, leave a comment with your take on what happens next, and I will see you in the next one. Stay healthy,